The morning air in Katmai National Park carried the distinct scent of wild earth, damp soil and vegetation that Ben Carter had traveled over 3,000 miles to experience. At 45, Benjamin William Carter had spent most of his life behind the polished glass windows of corporate offices in Philadelphia, watching the seasons change through temperature-controlled environments while managing investment portfolios. His wife, Melissa, had insisted on this trip to Alaska, a chance to disconnect from screens and reconnect with each other on their 20th anniversary. Their marriage had weathered the customary storms, career pressures, raising their daughter Emma, who was now in college, and the subtle drift that time inevitably brings to long relationships. "I can't believe we're actually here," Ben said, adjusting the straps of his brand new backpack. The gear store in Anchorage had outfitted him with everything a tourist in bear country might need: bear spray canister dangling from his belt, whistle around his neck, and the moisture-wicking layers that the sales associate had insisted were essential. Ben had nodded along, purchasing everything recommended without question. Money wasn't an issue. Safety was. Melissa smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners, betraying her age, despite the subtle work she'd had done the previous winter. "You've been talking about Alaska for years, Ben. I figured it was time." She extended a collapsible selfie stick, attaching her phone to the end. "Emma made me promise to document everything. She thinks we're having a midlife crisis." The gravel crunched beneath their hiking boots as they made their way toward the meeting point for their guided tour. The Valley of 10,000 Smokes stood as a testament to the volcanic forces that had shaped this landscape, a fitting backdrop for their adventure into the wild. The tour company had briefed them extensively. Katmai was home to some of the largest concentrations of brown bears in the world, particularly in the summer months when salmon ran thick in the brooks and rivers. Their guide, Ryan Matthews, greeted the small group with practiced confidence. In his early 30s, Ryan had the weathered look of someone who spent more time outside than in, with sun-creased eyes and a full beard that seemed to function as both style choice and face warmer. 5 other tourists completed their party: a retired couple from Seattle, who had visited Alaska annually for the past decade, a young honeymoon couple from Texas who couldn't seem to stop touching each other, and a solitary photographer burdened with equipment that likely cost more than Ben's first car. "Morning, folks," Ryan announced, scanning the group with keen eyes. "Welcome to Bear Country. Before we head out, we need to go over some basic safety protocols." He patted the large-caliber revolver holstered at his hip. "This is an absolute last resort. In 15 years of guiding, I've never had to use it, and I don't plan to start today." Ryan proceeded to explain proper bear encounter etiquette. Make noise while hiking to avoid surprising bears, stay grouped together, and never run if you encounter a bear. That triggers a predatory response, he explained, making deliberate eye contact with each member of the group. If a bear charges, it's often a bluff. Stand your ground. If it makes contact, play dead for a brown bear, fight back for a black bear. Ben nodded, mentally cataloging the information while adjusting his bear spray holster. The canister felt reassuring against his hip, though he hoped he wouldn't need to use it. The bear safety video they'd watched at the lodge had emphasized that bear spray was highly effective, but only if deployed correctly. Upwind, in a sweeping motion, creating a cloud between you and the charging animal. "Any questions before we head out?" Ryan looked around the semicircle of tourists. The photographer raised a hand. "How close will we get to the bears today?" Ryan's expression remained neutral. "We'll observe from designated viewing platforms at Brooks Falls. The ID bears there are habituated to human presence at a distance, but make no mistake, these are wild animals, not attractions in a zoo. We maintain a minimum distance of 50 yards, more if the bear appears stressed or aggressive." As they began their trek along the well-maintained trail, Melissa leaned close to Ben. "Are you nervous?" she whispered. Ben considered the question. There was a tremble of anticipation in his chest, but he wasn't sure if it was fear or excitement. "A little," he admitted, "but Ryan seems to know what he's doing." The morning unfolded into a series of breathtaking vistas. Ryan proved knowledgeable about not just bears, but the entire ecosystem, pointing out paw prints in muddy sections of the trail, identifying bird calls that echoed through the spruce forests, and explaining how the volcanic soil supported the diverse vegetation around them. The retired couple, Bob and Nancy Peterson, contributed occasional observations from their previous visits, while the photographer, who had introduced himself simply as Keith, darted ahead at times to capture the perfect morning light on distant mountains. By mid-morning, they reached an elevated wooden platform overlooking a section of Brooks River, where salmon fought against the current, their silver bodies flashing in the sunlight as they leaped up small cascades. The platform stood as a testament to the National Park Service's careful balance between visitor access and wildlife protection. Sturdy railings and designated viewing areas kept humans a safe distance from the water's edge where bears might appear. "If we're lucky," Ryan explained, "we'll see bears fishing. Late July is prime time for this behavior. The salmon are running and the bears need to fatten up before winter hibernation." The group settled in, cameras ready. Ben found himself scanning the opposite shoreline with an intensity that surprised him. The primal desire to witness these apex predators in their natural habitat had overcome his earlier apprehension. Melissa set up her phone on the selfie stick, positioning it to capture both their faces and the scenic backdrop behind them. "Emma will love this," she said, checking the frame. "Smile, Ben." He obliged with the practiced smile of countless corporate photos, but his eyes kept drifting to the edges of the frame, hoping for movement among the tall grasses. An hour passed, with no bear sightings, though the experience was far from dull. The salmon provided constant entertainment, their determination against the current, a metaphor that wasn't lost on Ben. At times, he found himself rooting for particular fish, mentally encouraging them as they gathered strength for another attempt up the falls. "There," Nancy said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper as she pointed toward a bend in the river about 100 yards downstream. A massive brown form had emerged from the trees, a grizzly bear moving with surprising grace for its size. Even at this distance, Ben could appreciate the sheer mass of the animal, its shoulder hump distinctive as it ambled toward the water's edge. Ryan raised a pair of binoculars. "Adult male, probably around 700 pounds. Looks like he's been successful this season." He offered the binoculars to Ben. "Want a closer look?" The bear filled Ben's vision when he raised the binoculars, its fur a mix of brown and blonde, glistening wet at the edges where it had already been fishing. The bear's face held an expression of intense concentration as it surveyed the water, paw raised in anticipation. With a sudden plunge, it thrust its head below the surface, emerging seconds later with a thrashing salmon secured between powerful jaws. "Magnificent," Ben whispered, passing the binoculars to Melissa. For the next 30 minutes, the group watched the bear's fishing demonstration with collective awe. Keith's camera shutter clicked rapidly, capturing each successful catch, and the bear's methodical consumption of the protein-rich parts of the salmon while discarding the rest. "That's why this ecosystem is so rich," Ryan explained. "The bears take what they need and leave the rest, feeding everything from eagles to insects. The nutrients eventually make their way back to the soil, supporting the vegetation." He gestured to the lush surroundings. "It's all connected." When the bear eventually retreated into the woods, satiated, a collective breath released from the group. Ben hadn't realized he'd been holding his shoulders tense for the entire viewing. "That was incredible," Melissa said, checking her phone. "I got some great video for Emma." The morning's success buoyed the group's spirits as they continued their hike after a trail lunch of sandwiches and energy bars. Ryan led them along a different route for the afternoon, promising varied scenery and different wildlife viewing opportunities. "This section of the trail will take us through slightly denser vegetation," Ryan explained. "Remember to stay close and make noise. We want the wildlife to know we're coming." The honeymoon couple, Mark and Jessica, started an impromptu rendition of "The Bear Went Over the Mountain," their Texas accents lending a unique flavor to the children's song. The group joined in sporadically, creating a cacophony that Ben thought would certainly alert any wildlife within a mile radius. The path narrowed as they moved deeper into a section of alder thickets. Ryan maintained a steady pace at the front, occasionally stopping to point out interesting flora or signs of animal passage. Ben found himself in the middle of the group, with Melissa just ahead of him, selfie stick extended to capture the journey. The attack happened with such unexpected speed that later, when Ben tried to piece together the sequence of events, he could only recall fragments, like a film reel with missing frames. They had reached a slight bend in the trail where a fallen log required stepping over. Nancy had just commented on a patch of wildflowers when a deep woofing sound cut through the group's chatter. Ryan's posture changed instantly. his hand moving to his bear spray rather than his firearm. "Stay together," he commanded, his voice steady but tight with tension. "Slowly now, let's back up." Ben caught only a glimpse of movement through the brush, a flash of brown fur moving, with purpose rather than the leisurely amble of the bear they'd observed fishing. This bear was coming directly toward the trail, its path intersecting with their group at the fallen log. The next moments stretched into surreal slow motion. The bear burst through the thicket, smaller than the one they'd seen fishing, but still imposingly large. Its ears were pinned back and it was huffing with each breath. Later, Ryan would explain this as signs of stress and agitation rather than predatory intent, but in that moment, all Ben registered was the enormous animal closing the distance with alarming speed. "Hold your ground!" Ryan shouted, positioning himself between the bear and the group, bear spray canister now extended in front of him. "It's likely a bluff charge." The Seattle couple and Keith managed to back away following Ryan's instructions. The honeymoon couple froze in place, the young woman gripping her husband's arm with white knuckles. Melissa stood 4 feet in front of Ben, the selfie stick still extended, now capturing video of the unfolding crisis. Ben's body betrayed him. Despite every instruction to hold his ground, to appear non-threatening, to avoid running at all costs, his legs began to move backward. 3 steps, 4. His heel caught on an exposed root, and he stumbled, losing his balance. The movement caught the bear's attention. In an instant, the animal changed course, veering directly toward Ben. He saw Ryan deploy the bear spray, but the cloud fell just short of creating an effective barrier. The bear swerved around it, momentum carrying it forward. "Ben!" Melissa's scream pierced through the chaos. He couldn't move. Every muscle locked in place as the primitive brain took control, activating neither fight nor flight, but the third, less discussed survival response: freeze. Ben stood perfectly still as 700 pounds of agitated grizzly bear charged directly at him. The impact he expected, the crushing weight, the tearing claws, never came. Instead, the bear veered. At the last possible moment, its massive form brushing past him close enough that he felt the coarse fur against his arm. But as it passed, the bear swung its head, whether in confusion as a warning or simply as part of its momentum, and the side of its skull connected with Ben's temple. The contact lasted less than a second. The bear's head grazed him with enough force to spin Ben around and knock him to the ground, but without the full crushing power it was capable of delivering. As he fell, Ben was vaguely aware of Ryan shouting and the sound of bear spray being deployed again, more effectively this time. Ben's vision swam as he lay on the ground, dirt and pine needles pressing against his cheek. Above him, the canopy of trees spun in lazy circles. A warm wetness trickled down the side of his face, and the metallic taste of blood filled his mouth where he'd bitten his tongue during the impact. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard Ryan's voice, tense but controlled. "It's moving away, everyone stay still." Moments stretched into minutes as the group remained frozen in place, listening to the sounds of the bear crashing through underbrush, moving away from the trail. Only when the forest had been silent for a full 5 minutes did Ryan approach, Ben, medical kit already open in his hands. "Don't move yet," the guide instructed, kneeling beside him. That was a close one. Melissa appeared in Ben's field of vision, her face pale with fear. "Oh my God, Ben, are you okay? The bear hit you. It hit your head." She still clutched the selfie stick, the phone now pointed at the ground, though Ben dimly realized it was still recording. Ryan's practiced hands examined the wound on Ben's temple. "Looks like a glancing blow, but head wounds bleed a lot. We need to clean this and get you back to the ranger station." He pressed a gauze pad against the side of Ben's head. "Can you tell me your name and what day it is?" The questions seemed absurd in the moment, but Ben recognized them as a concussion check. "Ben Carter, Tuesday, July 28th. His own voice sounded strange to him, as though coming from somewhere else. "Good," Ryan nodded, helping Ben to sit up slowly. "Any dizziness? Nausea?" "Both," Ben admitted, the world tilting alarmingly as he reached a seated position. "But I can walk, I think." The dynamics of the group had shifted entirely. The honeymoon couple stood huddled together some distance away, the young woman quietly crying against her husband's chest. The Seattle couple had moved closer, Nancy already offering spare clothing to use as additional bandaging if needed. Keith, the photographer, stood frozen, his expensive camera hanging unused around his neck, face ashen. "I'm going to call this in," Ryan said, pulling out a satellite phone. "We need to get back to the trailhead as efficiently as possible." While Ryan made the call, Nancy knelt beside Ben, her grandmotherly presence somehow reassuring. "I've seen bears on every trip up here," she said conversationally, as though discussing the weather rather than the near-fatal encounter they'd just experienced. "But never this close. You were very lucky." Lucky wasn't exactly how Ben felt at that moment, with his head throbbing and blood soaking through the gauze Ryan had applied, but he understood what she meant. The bear could have done much worse. The hike back to the trailhead took twice as long as their journey in. Ryan reorganized the group, placing himself at the front with Ben and Melissa directly behind him, setting a pace that balanced urgency with Ben's impaired condition. The Seattle couple brought up the rear, Bob now carrying Keith's camera bag, to allow the shaken photographer to move more easily. They sang loudly as they walked, not out of joy but as a continuous noise to alert any other bears to their presence. The cheerful melodies created a surreal contrast to Ben's condition and the group's collective shock. Every step sent a jolt of pain through Ben's skull, but the alternative, waiting for emergency evacuation in the wilderness, seemed worse. Melissa walked beside him, one arm around his waist for support, the other still absently holding the selfie stick. "You're still recording," Ben noted, his voice rough. Melissa glanced at the phone with surprise, as though she'd forgotten it. Was there? "Oh, should I stop it?" Something made Ben shake his head, immediately regretting the movement. "No, keep it going. Documentation, right?" The word triggered something in his professional mind, the part that assessed risk and planned for contingencies. Documentation would be important for insurance, for potential medical claims, for the report that would undoubtedly need to be filed. When they finally reached the trailhead, a park ranger vehicle was waiting, lights flashing without sirens. Two uniformed rangers approached quickly, medical kits in hand. Ben recognized the practiced efficiency of first responders as they took over from Ryan, conducting a more thorough assessment of his condition. "Probable concussion, possible skull fracture," the female ranger reported into her radio after examining the wound. "We'll transport to the medical center in King Salmon." She turned to Ben. "Sir, can you tell me what happened?" The group erupted into overlapping accounts. Ryan managed to quiet them and gave a concise report of the encounter, the bear's sudden appearance, signs of agitation rather than predatory behavior, the glancing blow as it passed Ben. "Classic defensive encounter," the male ranger nodded, helping Ben into the back of the vehicle. "Sounds like you surprised it, and it was trying to neutralize the perceived threat." Melissa climbed in beside Ben, finally lowering the selfie stick and stopping the recording. "I'm coming with you," she said, not a question but a statement of fact. The drive to the medical center passed in a blur of pain and disjointed thoughts. Ben found himself fixating on strange details: the ranger's nameplate, Walker, the smell of antiseptic in the vehicle, the way his blood had dried in patterns like tiny river deltas on his hiking pants. King Salmon Medical Center was a modest facility, but the staff moved with practiced efficiency when the rangers brought Ben through the doors. Within minutes, he was being examined by a doctor who introduced himself as Dr. Chen, his gentle hands probing the wound with practiced precision. "You're going to need stitches, Mr. Carter," Dr. Chen explained, preparing a syringe of local anesthetic. "And we'll need to run a CT scan to check for fractures or internal bleeding." As nurses prepped him for the procedures, Ben became aware of activity in the hallway, the low murmur of official voices, the scratching of pens on forms. A different park ranger, older with a salt and pepper mustache, spoke with Melissa outside the treatment room door, nodding as she gestured with her hands, mimicking the bear's movement. The stitches required 17 delicate sutures along Ben's temple, extending into his hairline. Dr. Chen worked methodically, explaining that head wounds typically healed well but often left scars. "You'll have a story to tell," he remarked, cutting the final suture. The CT scan revealed no skull fracture or internal bleeding, but confirmed a moderate concussion. "You'll need to rest for several days," Dr. Chen advised. "No screens, no reading, no strenuous activity, and someone should wake you every few hours tonight to check on you." Melissa nodded seriously, already taking mental notes. "We're supposed to fly back to Philadelphia on Friday. Is it safe for him to travel?" Dr. Chen hesitated. "I'd prefer he stay local for at least 3 days for follow-up, but if there are no complications, a flight on Friday should be possible. He'll need to take it very easy, though." The paperwork seemed endless. Medical forms, insurance information, and finally, the official National Park Service incident report. Ranger Peterson, no relation to Bob and Nancy from the tour, sat beside Ben's hospital bed, clipboard in hand. "We need as detailed an account as you can manage," he explained. "Bear encounters are taken very seriously, especially when injury occurs." Ben struggled to organize his thoughts through the fog of pain medication. "It happened so fast," he began. "We were hiking single file, making noise like we were supposed to. Then suddenly there was this huffing sound." As he recounted the events, Ben became aware of gaps in his memory, moments lost to the rush of adrenaline and the impact of the blow. "I don't remember falling," he admitted, "just being on the ground afterward." Ranger Peterson nodded understandingly. "That's common with traumatic events. The mind protects itself." He made notes as Ben spoke, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "And the bear's behavior after contact, did it continue to act aggressively?" Ben shook his head carefully. "No, it just left. Ryan, our guide, used the bear spray and it moved away, into the woods." "Textbook defensive encounter," Ranger Peterson confirmed, echoing what the other ranger had said earlier. "The bear felt threatened, made contact to neutralize what it perceived as a danger, then left when the threat was removed." He closed his notebook. "We'll monitor the area, but it's unlikely we'll take any action against the animal. It was displaying natural behavior in its habitat." There was something both reassuring and unsettling about this conclusion. The bear would continue its life unchanged, while Ben's had been irrevocably altered in that brief moment of contact. Melissa appeared in the doorway, her phone in hand. "I've got the whole thing on video," she told Ranger Peterson, "from the moment we heard it until after Ben was on the ground." The ranger's eyebrows raised. "That would be extremely helpful for our report. May I see it?" Ben watched as Ranger Peterson and Melissa huddled over her phone, watching the encounter. The ranger's expression remained professional, but Ben noted how his eyes widened slightly at certain moments. When the video ended, he looked up at Ben with new appreciation. "Mr. Carter, you are an incredibly lucky man. That bear could have done much worse." It was the second time someone had described him as lucky today, and Ben still wasn't sure he agreed with the assessment. The lodge they'd booked for their Alaskan adventure had moved them to a ground-floor room to accommodate Ben's condition. By evening, word of the encounter had spread throughout the small lodge, and Ben found himself the reluctant center of attention as other tourists stopped by to express concern and barely disguised beneath the sympathy, curiosity. Melissa managed the visitors with diplomatic skill, thanking them for their concern while protecting Ben from too much stimulation. "The doctor said he needs rest," she explained firmly to a particularly persistent couple from Michigan who seemed determined to hear every detail firsthand. When they were finally alone, Melissa sat on the edge of the bed, scrolling through her phone. "Ryan called," she said. "The tour company is refunding our money and sending a gift basket. He also said Keith wants to share some photos he took just before, you know." Ben nodded, immediately regretting the movement as pain lanced through his temple. "Have you watched it again? The video?" Melissa looked up, her expression carefully neutral. "Yes, it's intense, Ben. Do you want to see it?" He considered the question. Part of him wanted to confront the moment, to see what had happened from an outside perspective. Another part feared reliving the terror so soon. "Not yet," he decided. "Maybe when we get home." That night, true to Dr. Chen's instructions, Melissa woke him every 3 hours, asking simple questions to check his cognitive function. "Who's the president? What's our daughter's name? Where are we?" Each time, Ben provided the correct answers before slipping back into uneasy sleep, filled with dreams of charging bears and endless forest paths. Morning brought a clearer head, but increased pain as the initial shock wore off and the reality of his injuries settled in. The bandage on his temple needed changing, revealing angry red skin surrounding the neat line of black stitches. Looking in the bathroom mirror, Ben barely recognized himself. Pale skin, dark circles under his eyes, and the stark evidence of his encounter marking the side of his face. Melissa helped him shower, standing just outside the curtain in case he got dizzy. The domestic intimacy of the moment struck Ben as both reassuring and slightly embarrassing. 20 years of marriage reduced to basic caregiving functions. "I called Emma," Melissa mentioned, as she helped him dress afterward. "She was freaking out, wanted to fly up here. I told her we'd be home in a few days. Ben lowered himself carefully onto the bed. Did you tell her about the video? I mentioned it. She wants to see it. Melissa hesitated. I think she's having trouble processing that her dad was attacked by a bear. It doesn't seem real to her. It hardly seemed real to Ben either, despite the physical evidence. There was a dreamlike quality to the memory now, details becoming simultaneously sharper and more surreal with each recollection. The days of mandated rest in King Salmon passed slowly. Ben slept most of the first day away, waking only for medication and simple meals that Melissa brought back to the room. By the second day, he felt stable enough to sit on the lodge's porch, watching float planes land on the river and tourists depart for the same tour they had taken. Ryan stopped by personally to check on him, bringing a basket of local Alaskan products, smoked salmon, wild berry preserves, and a carved wooden bear that struck Ben as either thoughtful or tasteless, depending on how he looked at it. The company wants to assure you that this was an extremely unusual occurrence, Ryan said, the careful phrasing suggesting involvement from the tour operator's legal department. We've updated our safety briefing to include your experience as an example of proper behavior during a defensive encounter. Ben raised an eyebrow. Proper behavior? I froze and got hit in the head. Ryan smiled sympathetically. You didn't run, which was the most important thing. And honestly, playing dead would have been the right move if the bear had knocked you down and continued to engage. Everything happened exactly as it should have in that situation, except for the part where you got injured. He glanced at the bandage. How many stitches? 17, Ben replied. Doctor says it'll scar. Badge of honor in Alaska, Ryan nodded. Listen, I've guided for 15 years and only had 3 close encounters before yours. What happened wasn't because you did anything wrong. Sometimes in their world, we're just in the wrong place at the wrong time. After Ryan left, Melissa sat beside Ben on the porch, scrolling through her phone. The video has over 3,000 views, she said quietly. Ben turned to her, wincing at the pain the movement caused. What do you mean? She looked slightly guilty. I posted it to my Instagram yesterday. I thought it was important to share what happened. As a warning, maybe, or just because it's so unbelievable. She handed him the phone. People are calling you a survivor. There are hundreds of comments. Ben stared at the screen, watching himself from Melissa's perspective, the bear bursting through the brush, his frozen stance, the moment of impact partially obscured. As Melissa's hand shook, and then the aftermath as he lay on the ground, blood beginning to seep from his temple. The entire encounter lasted less than 30 seconds on video. The comments ranged from genuine concern to armchair experts critiquing everything from the group's noise level to Ryan's bear spray technique. Some questioned why Ben hadn't deployed his own spray. Others praised his instinct not to run. A few tasteless comments suggested the bear should have finished the job to teach tourists to respect nature, while others shared their own, much less dramatic bear encounter stories. Ben handed the phone back without scrolling further. I wish you'd asked me before posting it. Melissa looked hurt. I'm sorry, I thought it just felt like something people should see. The rangers even said the video was helpful for educational purposes. There's a difference between sharing it with park rangers and sharing it with the entire internet, Ben said, too tired to muster real anger. Now I'm just another viral video. Guy gets hit by bear, next up kid falls off skateboard. Melissa put her hand over his. It's not like that. People are genuinely concerned, and the tour company reached out through Instagram. They want permission to use parts of the video for their safety training. Of course they do, Ben sighed. Free promotional material. Take our tour, you might get attacked by a grizzly. That's not fair, Ben. They've been nothing but supportive. He knew she was right, that his bitterness was unwarranted and likely a side effect of the concussion and pain medication. I know, he conceded. I didn't expect to become a spectacle. By Thursday, Dr. Chen cleared Ben for travel, though with strict instructions to follow up with his primary care physician in Philadelphia immediately upon return. The stitches would need to remain for 10 days, and the concussion symptoms, headaches, sensitivity to light and sound, occasional dizziness might persist for weeks. Their flight from King Salmon to Anchorage was uneventful, though Ben was acutely aware of the stares his bandaged head attracted. In the Anchorage airport, waiting for their connecting flight to Seattle, a middle-aged woman approached them hesitantly. Excuse me, she said, looking between Ben and Melissa. "Are you the couple from the bear video? My sister sent it to me. Yesterday." Ben felt his stomach tighten. "Yes," Melissa answered when he remained silent. "That's us." The woman seemed genuinely moved. "I just wanted to say, I'm glad you're okay. My husband and I are headed to Katmai next week, and your video really drove home how quickly things can happen out there. Be sure to follow your guide's instructions," Ben said automatically. "Make noise on the trail, and remember that you're in their territory, not the other way around." The woman nodded earnestly before returning to her seat several rows away, where she immediately began speaking to her companion while glancing back at Ben. "See?" Melissa squeezed his hand. "The video is helping people." Ben wasn't convinced. There was something fundamentally disturbing about having one of the most terrifying moments of his life reduced to a cautionary tale for strangers. Yet he couldn't deny that if he'd seen such a video before their trip, he might have been even more vigilant on the trail. The flight home stretched Ben's endurance to its limits. The pressure changes during takeoff and landing sent spikes of pain through his head, and the constant engine noise aggravated his concussion symptoms. By the time they landed in Philadelphia, he was pale and sweating, barely able to navigate the terminal without Melissa's support. Emma was waiting for them at baggage claim, her face a mix of concern and curiosity as she spotted her father's bandaged head. She rushed forward, embracing him carefully before turning to hug her mother. "Dad, oh my God," she exclaimed, stepping back to examine him. "You look awful. Are you okay? Mom sent me the video, but seeing you in person..." She trailed off, seemingly at a loss for words. "I'm fine," Ben assured her, the phrase becoming automatic after days of repeating it to concerned lodge guests, flight attendants, and fellow passengers. "Just tired and sore, nothing that won't heal." The drive home from the airport was mercifully quiet. Emma had inherited her mother's skill for knowing when to let silence prevail, though Ben caught her glancing at him in the rearview mirror frequently as she drove. They passed familiar landmarks: the office complex where Ben had worked for the past 15 years, the shopping center where Emma had gotten her first part-time job in high school, the park where they taught her to ride a bike, all unchanged. While Ben felt fundamentally altered, home was exactly as they'd left it, yet it felt strangely unfamiliar to Ben as he stepped through the front door. The controlled environment of their suburban Philadelphia house, the carefully selected furniture, the framed family photos, the kitchen with its gleaming appliances, seemed disconnected from the man who had stood face to face with a wild grizzly bear just days before. Emma had prepared the downstairs guest room for Ben, correctly anticipating that stairs would be challenging in his condition. The thoughtfulness of the gesture brought an unexpected lump to his throat. "Thanks, sweetheart," he said, sinking gratefully onto the bed. "I'm going to rest for a bit." "I'll wake you for dinner," Melissa promised, helping him remove his shoes. "Emma's staying over tonight to help keep an eye on you." Sleep came quickly, but brought with it vivid dreams. The bear's approach replayed in endless variations, sometimes ending with the glancing blow he'd actually experienced, other times with the full attack his primitive brain had expected. He woke disoriented, the bedroom unfamiliar for several panic-filled seconds before recognition settled in. Dinner was a subdued affair, Ben's appetite diminished by medication and fatigue. Emma filled the silence with updates about her summer internship at an environmental non-profit, her voice deliberately cheerful in a way that reminded Ben of how people spoke around hospital beds. "Your video hit 10,000 views, she mentioned, as they finished eating. Someone reposted it on a wildlife awareness page. There are all these comments from bear experts analyzing what happened. Ben set down his fork. "I don't want to know." Emma exchanged a glance with her mother. "Sorry, I thought..." "It's fine," Ben interrupted. I lived it. I don't need to see strangers dissecting it frame by frame." Later that night, after Emma had gone to sleep in her old bedroom upstairs, Melissa sat on the edge of the guest bed, a tablet in her hands. "The National Park Service called while you were napping," she said. "They've completed their incident report." The ranger emailed a copy. Ben took the tablet, scrolling through the official document. The clinical language transformed his experience into something sterile and distant. Subject encountered adult female brown bear, Ursus arctos, with no visible cubs on Rainbow River Trail at approximately 14:30 hours. Bear displayed defensive behaviors consistent with a surprise encounter. Contact was minimal and defensive in nature. Subject sustained moderate injury, laceration to right temple requiring 17 sutures, concussion from incidental contact as bear passed. No aggression displayed post-contact. Bear departed area immediately following encounter. No action taken regarding bear. Trail temporarily closed for 24 hours following incident. Reopened after monitoring, showed no continuing bear activity in immediate area. The report included GPS coordinates of the encounter, measurements of the trail width at that location, and environmental conditions at the time. There was a reference to Melissa's video being reviewed as part of the investigation, noted as corroborating witness statement that bear behavior was defensive rather than predatory. The final paragraph contained recommendations. Incident consistent with normal bear behavior in defensive situation. No changes to park protocols indicated. Continuing emphasis on visitor education regarding proper behavior in bear country essential. Tour guide Ryan Matthews followed proper protocols, and his actions likely prevented more serious injury. Ben handed the tablet back to Melissa. So that's that. File closed. What were you expecting? She asked gently. He shrugged, immediately regretting the movement. I don't know, something more, I guess. It just seems so routine. To them, it's just another bear being a bear. And to us? Ben considered the question. To me, it was the closest I've ever come to understanding how small we really are. That bear could have killed me without even trying hard, and the official response would have been the same. Bear behaving normally. Unfortunate outcome for human. Melissa took his hand. But it didn't kill you. You're here, and we're having this conversation, and soon you'll heal and go back to work and life will continue. She paused. Does that bother you? That life just goes on? The question struck deeper than Ben expected. Did it bother him? There was something profound about having faced mortality so directly, only to return to dishwashers and email inboxes and utility bills. I'm not sure yet, he answered honestly. Ask me again in a few weeks. The follow-up appointment with his primary care physician yielded no surprises. Dr. Patterson confirmed the concussion diagnosis and referred Ben to a neurologist for monitoring, but expected a full recovery. The stitches could come out in another week, and he cautiously approved Ben's return to work the following Monday, provided he started with half days and avoided stressful situations. The brain needs time to heal, Dr. Patterson explained. Pushing too hard too soon can prolong recovery significantly. Ben nodded, having already experienced how quickly cognitive fatigue set in when he attempted to read or use screens for more than a few minutes. What about the scar? He asked, touching the tender skin around the stitches. Dr. Patterson examined the wound carefully. It's healing nicely, but yes, you'll have a visible scar. It might fade somewhat over time. If it bothers you cosmetically, there are procedures that can minimize its appearance later on. Somehow, the confirmation that the scar would be permanent felt appropriate to Ben. The encounter had marked him internally. It seemed fitting that there would be an external reminder as well. The weekend passed in a blur of rest and brief visitors, close friends who'd heard about the incident and wanted to see for themselves that Ben was all right. Each telling of the story became more mechanical, the details recited rather than relived. Ben noticed how each listener's eyes widened at the same points in the narrative, how they asked the same questions. Were you scared? Did you think you were going to die? What does it look like now? He showed the wound to those who asked, enduring their winces and sympathetic noises with patient resignation. Some mentioned having seen the video, offering their own analysis of what they would have done in the same situation. Ben listened politely, knowing the gap between hypothetical courage and actual response in the moment of crisis. Monday morning arrived with a sense of surreal normalcy. Ben dressed in his usual work attire, navy slacks, light blue button-down polished shoes, the bandage on his temple the only visible disruption to his professional appearance. Melissa drove him to the office, both agreeing that he shouldn't drive until the neurologist cleared him. Call me if you need to come home early, she insisted as she pulled up to the building's entrance. Don't push. Yourself. The investment firm where Ben had worked for 15 years welcomed him back with the awkward concern of people who have rehearsed their reactions. His assistant, Darla, had placed a small stuffed bear on his desk, a joke that landed differently than probably intended. His boss, Martin, stopped by to express relief at his return, while transparently assessing whether Ben was truly ready to be back. We've redistributed your more urgent clients for now, Martin explained. Just ease back in. review the portfolios, and let us know when you're ready to start taking client calls again." The caution in Martin's tone suggested he expected Ben to be changed by the experience. More fragile, perhaps, or unstable. Ben couldn't entirely blame him. Near-death experiences were supposed to be transformative, weren't they? The problem was Ben wasn't sure yet exactly how he had been transformed. By lunchtime, the fluorescent lights and constant low-level office noise had triggered a headache that made focusing impossible. Ben conceded defeat, calling Melissa for a ride home hours earlier than planned. "It's completely normal," she assured him as they drove. "Dr. Patterson said to expect setbacks, you just need more time." But time seemed to be moving strangely for Ben since the encounter. Some moments stretched endlessly, the pain of his headaches, the middle of the night when sleep eluded him, while others compressed into nothing, hours disappearing without memory or meaning. The stitches came out the following week, leaving a raised pink line that curved from his temple into his hairline. The neurologist confirmed that his concussion symptoms were resolving appropriately, though she warned it might be months before he felt completely normal again. "The brain is remarkably resilient," she explained, "but it heals on its own schedule. You can't force it." Work became manageable as Ben learned to pace himself, taking breaks before the headaches became debilitating, limiting client interactions to those he'd worked with for years who wouldn't be alarmed by his occasional lost train of thought or need to reschedule when symptoms flared. At home, life settled into a new routine. Melissa had taken a leave of absence from her part-time position at a local gallery to be available for Ben's recovery, though he insisted he was capable of managing on his own. Emma called daily, her concern gradually shifting from his physical recovery to his emotional state. "You seem different, Dad," she remarked during one evening call. Quieter. Ben considered this observation. "I suppose I am. I'm still sorting through it all." "The video hit 20,000 views yesterday," she mentioned cautiously. "Some nature documentary guy wants to interview you and Mom for a segment on bear safety. Mom forwarded you the email." Ben felt a flare of irritation. "I'm not interested in becoming the poster child for bear attacks. It might help other people," Emma suggested. "Your story could prevent someone else from getting hurt." "My story," Ben repeated, the phrase feeling hollow. "That's what it is now, a story. Something that happened to me, not something that's still happening." But that wasn't entirely true. The encounter continued to unfold within him, reshaping his understanding of himself and his place in the world. At random moments, the reality of what had happened would hit him anew. Standing in the shower, driving to work, watching mindless television, the sudden realization that he had stood face to face with one of nature's most powerful predators and survived by mere chance. 3 weeks after returning home, Ben finally worked up the courage to watch the video again. Alone in his home office while Melissa attended a gallery opening, he found the file on his laptop where she had saved it from her phone. The footage was shakier than he remembered, Melissa's hand unsteady as the events unfolded. He watched himself from behind, the blue of his new hiking shirt, the stiff posture as the bear emerged from the brush. The audio captured gasps from the group, Ryan's measured commands, and then Melissa's scream as the bear charged. The moment of impact happened, so quickly that Ben had to rewind and watch it again at half speed. The bear's head swung sideways as it passed him, connecting with his temple in what looked almost like an accidental gesture, rather than an intentional attack. Then his body crumpling to the ground, blood appearing almost immediately along his hairline. Ben closed the laptop, his hands trembling slightly. The video showed exactly what had happened, yet somehow failed to capture what the experience had actually been. The primal fear, the sense of insignificance in the face of natural force, the strange peace of complete surrender when he knew he couldn't escape. That night, he dreamed of the bear again, but differently. In this dream, he watched from outside himself as the bear passed by, its fur brushing his arm, its head connecting with his temple. But instead of continuing into the forest, the bear stopped and turned back, looking directly at Ben with eyes that held neither aggression nor fear, just a pure animal awareness, recognizing him not as prey or threat, but simply as another being sharing a brief moment in time. Ben woke from the dream feeling oddly settled, as though some question had been answered. He lay in the darkness beside Melissa's sleeping form, listening to the quiet rhythms of their home, the refrigerator's hum, the central air conditioning, cycling on and off, the occasional car passing on their suburban street. In the Alaskan wilderness at that moment, the bear that had marked him was perhaps fishing in a stream, fattening for the coming winter, entirely unaware of the significance it held in a human life hundreds of miles away. The thought brought an unexpected smile to Ben's face. The next morning, he declined another interview request, this one from a cable television show specializing in survival stories, but for different reasons than before. The encounter no longer felt like something he needed to process publicly or share as a cautionary tale. It had become something private and personal, a moment between himself and the wild that existed outside the human framework of meaning and narrative. At work, Ben found his priorities shifting subtly. Client concerns that once seemed urgent, a 0.25% difference in returns, minute fluctuations in emerging markets, now struck him as remarkably trivial. He found himself advising his clients toward more balanced approaches, emphasizing long-term security over short-term gains. "You've become quite the philosopher lately," remarked Arthur Jensen, a client of 15 years, after Ben had gently discouraged him from an aggressive investment strategy. "Is this the bear's influence?" He gestured toward the now fading scar on Ben's temple. Ben smiled. "Maybe. Let's just say I've gained some perspective on what constitutes actual risk." 6 weeks after the encounter, the video's popularity had begun to wane, though it continued to circulate in wilderness survival forums and bear safety discussions. Melissa had declined further interview requests on Ben's behalf, understanding now his desire for privacy around the experience. The National Park Service sent a follow-up email requesting permission to use an edited version of the video for their visitor education program. After consideration, Ben agreed to this limited use, specifying that his name not be used and that the video be presented as an example of proper bear encounter protocols rather than as a sensationalized near miss. The scar on his temple faded, from angry red to pale pink, still visible but no longer drawing immediate attention. Ben found himself touching it absent-mindedly during moments of reflection, a physical connection to the experience that continued to resonate within him. Fall arrived in Philadelphia, bringing cooler temperatures and changing leaves. Emma visited for a weekend, remarking on her father's improved color and energy. They walked through Fairmount Park, the urban green space a pale echo of the Alaskan wilderness, but beautiful in its own domesticated way. "Do you think you'll go back?" Emma asked as they rested on a bench overlooking the Schuylkill River. "To Alaska, I mean." Ben considered the question seriously. "Yes," he said finally. "Not to the same place, probably, but there's something about that landscape that gets under your skin. I'd like to see it again, but with this new understanding." "That you're not invincible," Emma teased gently. "That I'm just a visitor," Ben corrected. "In that world and maybe in this one too." He gestured toward the river, where kayakers navigated the current. "We build these environments where we feel in control, offices, houses, even parks like this one. But it's an illusion, really. The bear reminded me of that." Emma studied her father's expression. "Most people would just come back with a fear of bears and camping." Ben laughed. "Oh, I definitely have a healthy respect for bears now. But it's more than that. It's hard to explain." "Try," Emma encouraged. Ben watched a fallen leaf drift along the river current. The bear was just being a bear. It wasn't malicious or evil. It perceived a threat and responded according to its nature. What happened to me was just a moment where two worlds collided briefly. The difference is I spent weeks thinking about that moment, while the bear probably forgot it minutes later. "And that's good?" Emma seemed uncertain. "It's liberating, in a way," Ben explained. "We humans spend so much time constructing meaning, analyzing experiences, trying to control outcomes. The bear just lives in the present moment, responding to what is. There's a simplicity in that I find appealing now." 2 months after the encounter, Ben's neurologist cleared him for all normal activities, the concussion symptoms having faded to occasional mild headaches that common over-the-counter medication could manage. Life had largely returned to its previous patterns, though Ben himself continued to feel the subtle shifts in his priorities and perspectives. The video, which had peaked at just over 40,000 views, had begun its slide into internet obscurity, occasionally experiencing small resurgences when shared in relevant forums or during particular news cycles about wildlife encounters. Ben had made peace with its existence, recognizing that whatever meaning strangers derived from watching those 30 seconds had little to do with his actual experience. Winter approached, bringing holiday preparations and family gatherings. At the Carter family's Thanksgiving dinner, Ben found himself the reluctant center of attention when his brother-in-law, already several glasses into the wine supply, brought up the bear incident to relatives who hadn't yet heard the full story. "Show them the video, Mel," he urged, reaching for his phone. "It's crazy. The bear actually hits him in the head." Ben caught Melissa's eye across the table, giving a small nod. It no longer bothered him to have the story told or the video shown. The encounter had become like the scar on his temple, a permanent part of him, but no longer raw or painful. As family members clustered around the phone, exclaiming and wincing at the appropriate moments, Ben stepped outside onto the porch, welcoming the crisp November air. Above, stars pierced the clear night sky, the same stars that had shone over Alaska during his time there, over the forests where bears now slept in winter dens. He touched the scar reflexively, feeling its slightly raised texture beneath his fingertips. In Alaska right now, the bear, his bear as he sometimes thought of it, would be deep in hibernation, its massive body conserving energy through the winter months, unaware of its brief but profound impact on a human life. The sliding door opened behind him, and Melissa stepped out, wrapping her arms around herself against the cold. "You okay out here?" Ben nodded, putting an arm around her shoulders. "Just thinking about the bear, about how random it all is," he replied. "If we'd been 5 minutes earlier or later on the trail that day, or if the bear had been slightly more aggressive or slightly less, or if Ryan hadn't been such a good guide, so many variables that could have changed everything." Melissa leaned against him. "I prefer to think it happened exactly as it was supposed to." Ben smiled at the thought. The bear might agree with you. No philosophizing, just immediate response to the moment. "Are you disappointed," Melissa asked suddenly, "that the whole thing just faded away? No major news coverage, no changes to park policy, nothing really changing except for us?" Ben considered the question, watching his breath form clouds in the cold air. "No," he said finally. "That's exactly how it should be. The bear goes on being a bear. The park goes on being a park. Tourists will still take the same trail and probably have completely uneventful hikes, and I go on with my life, just a little bit different than before." "Different how?" Melissa pressed. Ben struggled to articulate what he'd been feeling these past months. "More present, I think. Less worried about next quarter's performance review or retirement plans 30 years from now. More aware that we're all just passing through." Melissa shivered, though whether from the cold or his words, Ben wasn't sure. "That sounds either very zen or very morbid." He laughed. "Maybe a bit of both. I'm still working it out." They stood in comfortable silence, looking up at the stars. Inside, they could hear faint laughter as the family continued watching the video, experiencing secondhand a moment that had irreversibly altered Ben's understanding of his place in the world. "We should go back in," Melissa suggested eventually. "It's freezing out here." Ben nodded, but remained still for one more moment, imagining the bear sleeping peacefully in its winter den, untroubled by meaning or memory, simply existing in perfect accordance with its nature. There was wisdom in that, he thought, a wisdom humans struggled to grasp through meditation and philosophy and religion, but which came naturally to the bear. "Yes," he agreed finally, turning toward the warm light of the house. "Let's go back." As they stepped inside, Ben carried with him the understanding that while the bear's story had ended at the edge of the forest, turning away after the brief contact, disappearing into the underbrush, continuing its solitary journey through the Alaskan wilderness, his own story continued to unfold, forever marked by those few seconds of intersection between two vastly different worlds. And in that continuation lay the profound difference between them: the bear, moving through the world, without reflection or narrative, and the human, forever changed by an encounter that the wilderness had already forgotten. Now let's move on to the story of the next survivor. The morning sun cast long shadows through the spruce trees as Megan Cole laced up her running shoes outside her modest apartment on the outskirts of Anchorage. At 28, she had the lean, sinewy build of someone who had made running a daily ritual. Her dirty blonde hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, and her gray eyes squinted slightly against the early light. The air had that particular Alaskan crispness to it, even in late spring, clean and sharp, with the faint scent of pine and wet earth. It was the kind of morning that made her glad she'd relocated from Seattle 3 years ago, despite her parents' concerns about her moving to the last frontier on her own. Megan checked her watch, 5:47 a.m., and adjusted her light running jacket. She had 2 hours before her shift at the Moose Drop-In, the local diner where she'd been waiting tables since arriving in Anchorage. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills while giving her time to pursue her real passion, landscape photography. The walls of her tiny one-bedroom apartment were adorned with her shots of the Chugach Mountains, their peaks catching the alpenglow at dawn or their slopes transformed by autumn colors. She'd sold a few prints to tourists at local markets, but her dream of making it as a professional photographer remained just that, a dream. She slipped her phone into the small zippered pocket of her running tights, along with her apartment key and a small canister of bear spray. The bear spray had been a gift from her boss, Ron, who had laughed at her initial naivety when she'd first arrived in Alaska. "City girl like you needs to understand what's out there," he'd said, handing her the canister. "Better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it." She'd rolled her eyes then, but she never went running without it now. The streets of her neighborhood were quiet this early, just a few cars warming up in driveways and the occasional fellow runner nodding in silent greeting. Megan kept a steady pace as she headed east, toward the trailhead that would take her into the foothills of the Chugach Mountains. She'd been extending her running route gradually over the past few months, pushing a little farther into the wilderness each time. There was something about being alone on these trails that centered her, made her feel both small and significant in the vastness of Alaska. 20 minutes later, she reached the trailhead. A wooden sign marked the start of the Eagle River Nature Center Trails, with warnings about wildlife and trail conditions. Megan paused to stretch, her breath forming small clouds in the cool air. The parking lot had only 2 other vehicles, a dusty pickup truck and a Subaru with a kayak rack, both likely belonging to early hikers or fishermen heading to the nearby stream. Megan started up the trail at an easy jog, her feet finding a rhythm on the packed earth. The forest seemed to close around her as she moved deeper into the woods, the sounds of civilization falling away, replaced by the whisper of wind through spruce needles and the occasional call of a bird. She felt the familiar loosening in her chest that came with these runs, the untangling of anxieties about money, career, and the relationship she'd left behind in Seattle. The trail began to climb, and Megan adjusted her pace accordingly, her calves burning pleasantly with the effort. She'd mapped out a route that would take her on a loop through the lower mountain trails and back to the trailhead within an hour, giving her plenty of time to shower and get to work. But as she reached a fork in the path, she hesitated. To the right was her usual route, well-traveled and predictable. To the left was a trail she hadn't taken before, narrower and less worn, leading higher into the mountains. Megan glanced at her watch. She was making good time. The temptation to explore, to see what new vistas might await her on the unfamiliar path, won out. She turned left, adjusting the small pack on her back that contained a water bottle and energy bar. The trail immediately became steeper and rougher, requiring more concentration to navigate the exposed roots and scattered rocks. But the exertion felt good, and when the trees thinned enough to offer glimpses of the valley below, with Anchorage just visible in the distance and Cook Inlet stretching beyond it, Megan knew she'd made the right choice. She paused at a small clearing to take a drink from her water bottle and catch her breath. According to her watch, she'd been running for 35 minutes. She should probably turn back soon if she wanted to stay on schedule, but the trail ahead curved enticingly around the mountainside, promising more stunning views. Just a little farther, she decided. The trail narrowed as it wound through a section of denser forest, the undergrowth pressing close on either side. Megan slowed to a walk in places where the path became unclear, her runners, instinct wary of twisted ankles on hidden obstacles. The forest was eerily quiet here, the bird calls that had accompanied her earlier run now absent. She became aware of her own breathing, the crunch of leaves and twigs beneath her feet, and the faint rustling of branches overhead. Rounding a bend in the trail, Megan stopped abruptly. 20 yards ahead, sitting in a patch of sunlight that broke through the canopy, was a bear cub. Its fur was a rich cinnamon brown, and it was pawing curiously at something on the ground, perhaps an insect or plant root. Megan's heart leaped into her throat, adrenaline surging through her system. Every Alaskan knew that a bear cub meant a mother bear was nearby, and there were few things more dangerous than coming between a mother and her young. She slowly reached for the bear spray in her pocket, her movements deliberately small and quiet. The cub hadn't noticed her yet, still engrossed in its discovery. Megan began to back away, placing each foot with extreme care to avoid snapping branches or kicking stones. She'd managed to retreat about 10 feet when a gust of wind rustled through the trees, carrying her scent toward the cub. The young bear's head shot up, its small black eyes finding her instantly. It made a soft whining sound, rising to its hind legs for a better look. Megan froze, her hand tightly gripping the bear spray, but not yet raising it. Maybe if she stayed still, the cub would lose interest and wander off. For several heartbeats, they stared at each other across the distance of the trail, two creatures equally surprised by the encounter. Then came the sound that turned Megan's blood to ice, a deep, guttural growl from somewhere off the trail to her right. The mother grizzly emerged from the trees with terrifying suddenness, her massive form moving with surprising speed and grace despite her size. She was enormous, at least 700 pounds, and standing over 7 feet tall on her hind legs, her brown fur appearing almost golden in the dappled sunlight. Her head swayed from side to side as she assessed the threat to her cub, lips pulled back to reveal yellowed teeth. Megan's training kicked in, all those safety talks from park rangers and wildlife pamphlets suddenly crystallizing into urgent directives in her mind. Don't run. Don't make eye contact. Back away slowly if possible. Play dead if attacked. The bear spray in her hand suddenly seemed woefully inadequate against the mountain of muscle and fur that was now dropping to all fours, its shoulders rolling with raw power as it began to move toward her. "Hey, bear," Megan said in a low, steady voice, trying to mask her terror. "I'm just passing through. I don't mean any harm." The words were as much to calm herself as to communicate with the bear. She took another careful step backward, then another. The grizzly grunted, a sound like distant thunder, and quickened its pace. The cub, seemingly emboldened by its mother's presence, bounced forward a few steps, curious but cautious. Megan's back pressed against a tree trunk. She hadn't realized she'd been moving off the trail in her retreat. The rough bark caught at her jacket, and in her panic to free herself, she made a sudden movement. It was all the provocation the mother bear needed. With a roar that seemed to shake the forest floor, she charged. Megan had time only to raise the bear spray, aim, and depress the trigger before diving to the side. The spray released with a hissing sound, creating a cloud of capsaicin that caught the bear full in the face. The grizzly reared back, pawing at her eyes and snout, but her momentum carried her forward. Megan scrambled to her feet and ran, not back down the trail, but toward a large spruce tree several yards away with low-hanging branches. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to put as much distance between herself and the enraged bear as possible. But she knew she couldn't outrun a grizzly. Her only hope was to climb, to get herself above the bear's reach. She reached the tree, just as she heard the bear crashing through the undergrowth behind her. Adrenaline gave her strength she didn't know she possessed, and she leaped, catching the lowest branch and pulling herself up with desperate speed. Higher and higher she climbed, her hands gripping rough bark, her feet finding purchase on knots and small branches. The bear reached the base of the tree seconds after Megan had begun her ascent, rising up on its hind legs again, its massive paws swiping at the trunk. Megan didn't stop climbing until she was 20 feet off the ground, wedged into a fork in the trunk where several large branches met. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and her lungs burned with each gasping breath. Below her, the grizzly circled the tree, occasionally standing to test the lower branches with her weight. The bear spray had clearly irritated her, but not enough to drive her away completely. The cub paced nervously at the edge of the clearing, making small plaintive sounds. Time seemed to stretch and distort as Megan clung to her perch. Minutes passed, or perhaps it was hours. She couldn't tell. Her legs began to cramp, and her hands scraped raw from her frantic climb throbbed painfully. The bear would occasionally wander a short distance away, only to return and rear up against the tree again, her claws scoring deep marks in the bark. During one of these circuits, Megan carefully shifted her position to reach her phone. The movement caught the bear's attention, and she charged the tree again, this time managing to get her front paws on a branch about 10 feet off the ground. The whole tree shook with the bear's weight, and Megan cried out involuntarily as she clutched at the trunk to keep from falling. The branch creaked ominously but held. After a moment of swaying precariously, the bear dropped back to all fours, circling once more with evident frustration. Megan took advantage of the momentary respite to pull out her phone. Her hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped it, but she managed to check the screen. No signal, of course. She was deep in the mountains, far from any cell towers. She couldn't call for help. A new wave of despair washed over her. How long would the bear stay? Would anyone come looking for her if she didn't show up for work? The trail she'd taken wasn't her usual route. Would searchers even know where to look? The questions tumbled through her mind, each more frightening than the last. The sun had risen higher now, warming the forest. Megan's mouth was dry, her water bottle inaccessible in her pack, which she'd dropped when she first encountered the cub. Below her, the mother bear had settled into a watchful vigilance, lying at the base of the tree but with her head up, eyes fixed on Megan's position. The cub had wandered a short distance away, digging at the forest floor and occasionally batting at insects. Megan tried to control her breathing, to think clearly through her fear. She remembered reading that bears could be persistent when they felt threatened, but they seldom maintained interest in treed humans for extended periods. If she could just wait it out, maybe the mother would eventually collect her cub and move on. As the morning wore on, the cramping in Megan's legs became increasingly painful. She shifted position carefully, trying to redistribute her weight without making sudden movements. The bear below had grown less vigilant, her head now resting on her paws, though her eyes still opened periodically to check on the human in the tree. It was during one of these position adjustments that disaster struck. Megan's foot slipped on a patch of moss-covered bark, and she lurched sideways. She managed to catch herself before falling, but in her scramble to regain her balance, her leg dangled momentarily lower than before. The movement galvanized the bear. She was on her feet in an instant, lunging upward with shocking speed. Megan felt rather than saw the swipe of claws catch her lower leg, tearing through the fabric of her running tights and into the flesh beneath. White-hot pain exploded from her calf, and she screamed, instinctively pulling her leg up and away from the bear's reach. Blood soaked through the torn material, warm and sticky against her skin. The pain was overwhelming, blocking out all other sensations for several seconds. When Megan could focus again, she saw that the bear had dropped back to the ground, but was now pacing with renewed agitation, her muzzle marked with Megan's blood. Carefully, fighting through waves of pain and nausea, Megan examined her injury as best she could from her awkward position. The bear's claws had left 3 deep parallel gashes in her calf, each several inches long. Blood continued to seep from the wounds, running down into her sock and shoe. She needed to stop the bleeding, but she had nothing to use as a bandage. With trembling fingers, she managed to unzip her jacket. Beneath it, she wore a long-sleeved running shirt. Using her teeth in one hand, the other maintaining a death grip on the branch beside her, she tore a strip from the bottom of the shirt. The fabric was thin and not ideal, but it was all she had. She wound it around her calf as tightly as she could manage, whimpering as the pressure intensified the pain. The makeshift bandage immediately began to soak through with blood, but it seemed to slow the bleeding somewhat. Below her, the bear had resumed her pacing, occasionally rising, to test the lower branches again. Megan's vision swam with tears of pain and fear. She thought about her parents in Seattle, who had worried about her move to Alaska. She thought about the photographs she'd never get to take, the places she'd never see. A strange calm settled over her as shock began to set in, a detached awareness that she might not survive this encounter. Then something changed. The cub, which had been exploring nearby, suddenly lifted its head and made a soft chuffing sound. The mother bear immediately turned toward it, alert to some disturbance Megan couldn't yet perceive. A moment later, she heard it too, voices on the trail, human voices coming closer. The mother bear's reaction was immediate. She huffed sharply at her cub, which scampered to her side. With a last look up at Megan, the grizzly turned and lumbered into the underbrush, her cub close behind. Within seconds, they had vanished into the dense forest, leaving only disturbed vegetation and scored earth as evidence of their presence. Megan could hardly believe it. She remained frozen in place, afraid the bear's departure was some sort of trick, that they were merely hiding nearby, waiting for her to descend. But as the human voices grew louder, accompanied by the crunch of boots on the trail, she found her voice. "Help," she called, her throat raw from fear and dehydration. "Help, I'm up here." There was a momentary silence, then, "Hello? Where are you?" "In the tree." Just off the trail, Megan shouted back, fresh tears, these of relief, streaming down her face. Two figures appeared on the trail moments later, a man and woman in hiking gear, looking around in confusion. Megan called again, and they spotted her high in the spruce tree, her blood-soaked leg immediately visible against the green of the branches. Jesus, the man said, a stocky figure with a salt and pepper beard. What happened? Bear, Megan managed. Mother and cub. She got my leg. The woman, tall and athletic with a red bandana around her neck, scanned the surrounding forest nervously. Is she still around? She just left when she heard you coming, Megan explained, her voice shaking, but I don't know if she's gone far. The man, who introduced himself as Dave, pulled out a canister of bear spray from his pack. I'll keep watch. Linda, help her down if you can. We need to get her to a hospital. Linda approached the tree cautiously, her eyes still darting to the forest around them. Can you climb down? We'll be right here. Megan tested her injured leg, wincing as pain shot up from her calf. I'll try, but I'm not sure I can put weight on my leg. Her descent was agonizing and precarious. Her hands, stiff from hours of gripping branches, could barely maintain their hold on the bark. Her injured leg was nearly useless, and she had to lower herself primarily with her arms and good leg. Linda talked her through it, offering encouragement and guidance about where to place her feet. When Megan was about 6 feet from the ground, her strength gave out. She slipped, falling the remaining distance and landing hard on the forest floor. Linda was at her side instantly, helping her to sit up as Megan gasped through the new wave of pain that radiated from her injured leg. Let me see, Linda said, her voice calm and authoritative. She carefully unwound the blood-soaked fabric from Megan's calf, revealing the 3 deep gashes beneath. These are deep. You're going to need stitches, and we need to clean them properly before infection sets in. Dave kept his eyes on the forest as he backed toward them. We need to move. That bear could come back. Linda nodded, already pulling supplies from her backpack, a proper first aid kit, water, and an emergency blanket. First things first, I'm going to clean these wounds as best I can, then wrap them properly. Then we'll get you out of here. Megan flinched as Linda poured clean water over the wounds, washing away dirt and drying blood. Are you a doctor? She asked through gritted teeth. Linda smiled briefly. Wilderness EMT. I teach first aid courses for backcountry guides. She applied antibiotic ointment from her kit, then wrapped Megan's leg with proper bandages, securing them firmly but not so tight as to cut off circulation. This is just temporary to get you to the hospital. You've lost blood, but not a dangerous amount. The real concern now is infection and tissue damage. When Linda finished bandaging the wounds, she and Dave helped Megan to her feet, or rather, to her good foot. They positioned themselves on either side of her, allowing her to drape her arms across their shoulders for support. The trek back to the trailhead was slow and painful. Megan could put almost no weight on her injured leg, and the trio had to stop frequently for her to rest. Along the way, Dave and Linda explained that they were weekend hikers from Anchorage who had been exploring some of the less-traveled trails. They'd heard about a mother grizzly with a cub being spotted in the area, but had decided to hike anyway, making sure to carry bear spray and make plenty of noise on the trail. You're lucky we decided to take this route, Dave said as they paused for another rest. Megan was pale and sweating from the exertion and pain. This isn't a heavily trafficked trail, especially on a weekday morning. I know, Megan replied, her voice small. I shouldn't have come this way alone. I knew better. Linda handed her a water bottle. Drink. You need to stay hydrated. After Megan had taken several sips, Linda continued, Everyone makes mistakes in the backcountry. The important thing is you survived, and you did the right thing climbing that tree. It took nearly 2 hours to reach the trailhead, a journey that would have taken Megan less than 40 minutes at a running pace. By the time they emerged from the forest, Megan was nearly delirious with pain and exhaustion. Dave and Linda helped her to their Subaru. They were the owners of the vehicle with the kayak rack, and carefully settled her in the back seat. Hospital's about 30 minutes from here, Dave said as he started the engine. Just hang in there. Megan nodded weakly, her leg throbbing with each heartbeat. She thought about her shift at the diner, which she was now definitely going to miss. She fumbled for her phone, finding it in her pocket where she'd stashed it after discovering there was no signal on the mountain. I need to call work, she mumbled, her fingers clumsy as she navigated to her contacts. Linda turned in the passenger seat to look at her. Don't worry about that now. Let's get you taken care of first." But Megan was already dialing Ron's number. The phone rang 4 times before his gruff voice answered. "Moose, drop in." "Ron, it's Megan," she said, her voice surprisingly steady despite her condition. "I'm not going to make it to work today. There was a bear. I'm on my way to the hospital." There was a startled silence on the other end. "A bear? Are you serious? Are you okay?" "Not really," Megan admitted, looking down at her bandaged leg. "It got my leg. Some hikers found me and they're taking me to the hospital now." "Jesus, Megan," Ron said, concern evident in his gruff voice. "Don't worry about your shift. Just take care of yourself. Do you need anything? Do you want me to call anyone for you?" Megan thought about her parents. They would panic if they heard about this, might even insist she move back to Seattle. "No, I'll be fine. I'll let you know when I know more." After ending the call, Megan leaned her head back against the seat, closing her eyes against the waves of pain. The adrenaline that had kept her going was fading, leaving her drained and shaky. The car moved swiftly along the highway toward Anchorage, Dave occasionally glancing at her in the rearview mirror with evident concern. Providence, Alaska Medical Center was bustling when they arrived. Dave pulled up to the emergency entrance, and Linda went inside to get help while he stayed with Megan. Within minutes, an orderly appeared with a wheelchair, and Megan was helped from the car to the chair, her legs screaming in protest at the movement. The emergency room was a blur of forms, questions, and examinations. Megan provided her insurance information and medical history to a brisk but kind nurse, while a doctor inspected her wounds. The doctor, a woman in her 40s with short gray hair and glasses, frowned as she examined the gashes. "These are deep," she confirmed, echoing Linda's assessment. "You're going to need quite a few stitches, and we'll need to clean them thoroughly to prevent infection. Bear claws can carry a lot of bacteria." She looked up at Megan. "When was your last tetanus shot?" Megan had to think through the fog of pain. 3 years ago, I think, when I moved to Alaska." The doctor nodded. "Good. We'll give you antibiotics as well as a precaution." She gestured to a nurse. "Let's get her prepped for debridement and suturing." What followed was one of the most painful experiences of Megan's life. Despite the local anesthetic injected around her wounds, the process of cleaning the gashes, removing dirt, debris, and damaged tissue was excruciating. Megan gripped the sides of the examination table, her knuckles white, as the doctor worked with meticulous care to ensure no foreign material remained in the wounds. The suturing was less painful, but took time, as each of the 3 gashes required multiple stitches to close. By the time the doctor finished, Megan's calf was crisscrossed with neat black sutures, the skin around them angry and red despite the thorough cleaning. 27 stitches total, the doctor announced, applying a sterile dressing over the wounds. "You're going to have some impressive scars, but with proper care you should heal well." She fixed Megan with a serious look. "However, you need to watch carefully for signs of infection, increased redness, warmth, swelling, pus, or fever." Bear attacks can lead to serious infections that don't respond to standard antibiotics. If you notice any of those symptoms, come back immediately." Megan nodded, too exhausted to speak. The doctor continued, writing on a prescription pad as she spoke. "I'm prescribing antibiotics. Take them exactly as directed, the full course, and pain medication. You'll need to keep weight off that leg as much as possible for at least a week, and you'll need to come back to have the stitches removed in about 10 to 14 days, depending on how you heal." A nurse returned with crutches, adjusting them to Megan's height and demonstrating how to use them properly. "These will be your best friends for the next week or so," she said with a smile. "Don't try to tough it out without them. You'll only delay your healing." By the time all the paperwork was completed and Megan was cleared to leave, it was mid-afternoon. Dave and Linda had waited in the hospital lobby, refusing to leave until they knew she was okay. When Megan emerged on her crutches, her leg heavily bandaged beneath her torn running tights, they both stood. "You didn't have to wait," Megan said, touched by their kindness. Linda shook her head. "Of course we did. How are you getting home?" Megan hadn't thought that far ahead. Her apartment was across town, and she obviously couldn't drive herself. "I guess I'll call a cab." "Nonsense," Dave said firmly. "We'll take you. Where do you live?" The ride to Megan's apartment was quiet, her energy completely depleted by the ordeal. She directed them through the streets of Anchorage to her small apartment complex on the city's east side. Dave insisted on helping her up the stairs to her second-floor unit, while Linda retrieved the prescriptions they'd filled at the hospital pharmacy on their way out. Inside her apartment, Megan sank gratefully onto her sofa, elevating her injured leg on a cushion as the doctor had instructed. Linda arranged the medication bottles on the coffee table and went to the kitchen to fill a glass of water. "You should take the first dose now," she said, returning with the water. "And you need to eat something with the antibiotics." Megan realized she hadn't eaten since early that morning, before her run. "There's not much in the fridge," she admitted. "I was planning to grocery shop after work today." Dave and Linda exchanged a look. "I'll go get some food," Dave offered. "Any preferences?" "Anything easy," Megan replied, overwhelmed by their generosity. "Soup, maybe? I don't think I have much of an appetite." After Dave left, Linda helped Megan change out of her torn, blood-stained running clothes and into comfortable sweats, careful to avoid disturbing the bandages. She then insisted on programming her phone number into Megan's contacts. "Call if you need anything," she said firmly. "I mean it. Dave and I live just on the other side of town." When Dave returned with soup, sandwiches, and a bag of basic groceries, they stayed just long enough to make sure Megan ate and took her medication before reluctantly preparing to leave. At the door, Linda turned back. "You should report the attack," she said. "The wildlife authorities need to know about aggressive bears, especially when humans are injured." Megan nodded tiredly. "I will." "And Megan," Linda added, "don't beat yourself up about this. You're not the first person to encounter a bear in those mountains, and you won't be the last. You survived, and that's what matters." After they left, the silence in the apartment was almost oppressive. Megan sat on the sofa, her leg throbbing, despite the pain medication beginning to take effect, and stared at the landscape photographs on her walls, the very mountains that had nearly claimed her life looking serene and harmless in the frames. The surreality of the morning's events washed over her in waves. Had it really only been a few hours since she'd set out on what was supposed to be a routine run? It felt like days, or even a lifetime ago. She reached for her phone, considering calling her parents, but hesitating with her finger over the contact. They would worry, might even insist on flying up to Alaska, and Megan wasn't sure she had the energy to manage their concern on top of everything else. Instead, she dialed the number for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, which she found after a quick internet search. The woman who answered was professional and efficient, taking down the details of Megan's encounter: location, time, description of the bears, and the nature of the attack. "We appreciate you reporting this," the woman said when Megan had finished her account. "We'll send a wildlife officer to the area to assess the situation. It sounds like the bear was defending her cub, which is normal behavior, not predatory. In cases like this, we typically don't remove the bear unless it shows unusually aggressive tendencies." "So nothing will happen?" Megan asked, a strange mix of relief and indignation washing over her. "We'll post warnings at the trailhead about the sighting, and we'll monitor the area more closely for a while," the woman explained. "But bears are a natural part of the Alaskan wilderness, Ms. Cole. We try not to interfere unless absolutely necessary." After hanging up, Megan sat with that thought for a while. Bears were a natural part of Alaska. She'd known that when she moved here, had even been thrilled by the idea of living somewhere so wild and untamed, but experiencing that wildness firsthand, feeling the raw power and indifferent ferocity of a mother bear protecting her young, had given her a new perspective on her place in this landscape. The pain medication was making her drowsy now, her eyelids heavy despite the persistent throbbing in her leg. She managed to maneuver herself to her bedroom, propping her leg on pillows as instructed, and falling into a fitful sleep filled with dreams of running through endless forests, always with the sensation of something massive and relentless just behind her. She woke to darkness and confusion, momentarily disoriented about where she was and why her leg hurt so badly. As the fog of sleep cleared, the events of the morning rushed back with startling clarity. The bear cub, the mother's charge, the tree, the claws ripping through her flesh. Megan fumbled for the lamp beside her bed, needing light to dispel the phantom sensations of being trapped in that tree with the bear circling below. Her phone showed it was just past 10 p.m. She'd slept for hours, yet she felt utterly exhausted. The pain in her leg had intensified as the medication wore off, and she hobbled to the living room to retrieve the prescription bottles. As she waited for the new dose to take effect, she checked her messages. 3 missed calls from Ron at the diner and a text. Checking in, how are you doing? Let me know if you need anything. And a missed call from her parents, her regular weekly check-in that she'd completely forgotten about in the chaos of the day. She texted Ron back first, a brief message thanking him for his concern and promising to keep him updated. Her parents would require an actual conversation, and Megan wasn't sure she was ready for that yet. Instead, she sent them a text saying she'd call tomorrow, making no mention of the bear attack. Despite her lingering exhaustion, Megan found herself unable to fall back asleep. Her mind kept replaying the attack in vivid detail, the bear's hot breath visible in the cool morning air, the sound of claws scraping bark, the white-hot pain as those claws tore into her flesh. She reached for her laptop, seeking distraction, and found herself searching for information about bear attacks in Alaska. The statistics were simultaneously reassuring and terrifying. Bear attacks were relatively rare, with fewer than 10 per year across the entire state, resulting in human injury. Most were defensive attacks by mothers with cubs, exactly the situation Megan had encountered. The fatality rate was even lower, averaging less than 1 death per year. But the accounts of survivors were harrowing, many describing lifelong psychological effects, ranging from heightened anxiety in outdoor settings to full-blown PTSD. Megan closed the laptop, unsettled by the thought that the mental scars of her encounter might outlast the physical ones. She hobbled to the kitchen for a glass of water, her crutches awkward in the confined space. As she waited for the tap to run cold, she caught her reflection in the window above the sink, pale, with dark circles under her eyes, her dirty blonde hair tangled from sleep. She barely recognized herself. The night passed slowly, a blur of fitful dozing, pain medication, and anxious thoughts. By morning, Megan felt hollow-eyed and wrung out, her injured leg a constant presence, even when she wasn't moving. She managed a shower, carefully keeping her bandaged calf outside the stream of water as instructed, and changed into fresh clothes. Her phone rang as she was making coffee one-handed, the other maintaining her balance on a crutch. It was Ron. "How are you doing, kid?" his gravelly voice asked when she answered. "I've been better," Megan admitted, "but I'm okay, just sore and tired." "I heard about your adventure on the news this morning," Ron said, surprising her. "Nothing major, just a small piece about a hiker being injured by a bear on the Chugach trails. They didn't name you, but I figured it had to be you from the timing and location." It was on the news. Megan felt a strange mix of validation and embarrassment. "Like I said, just a small segment. They interviewed some ranger about bear safety. Guess the Fish and Game folks passed it along to the media." Megan sighed. "Great. My parents watch Alaskan news online sometimes. If they see it..." "Speaking of which," Ron continued, "you planning to work your shifts this week? No pressure either way, but I need to know if I should call in someone to cover." The question caught Megan off guard. She hadn't thought that far ahead, had been so focused on just getting through each painful hour that planning for the week seemed impossibly distant. "I don't think I can," she said finally. "The doctor said to stay off my leg for at least a week, and I can't exactly wait tables on crutches." "No problem," Ron assured her. "Just focus on healing up. Your job will be waiting when you're ready to come back." After hanging up, Megan felt a wave of anxiety about finances. She had some savings, but not much, and missing a week or more of work and tips would strain her budget significantly. She pushed the worry aside for now. There was nothing to be done about it. Her next call was to her parents, a conversation she'd been dreading but couldn't put off any longer. Her mother answered on the second ring, her voice immediately concerned. "Megan, is everything okay? We missed your call yesterday." Megan took a deep breath. "I'm okay, Mom, but something happened." She proceeded to tell her parents about the bear attack, downplaying the danger and her injuries as much as possible without outright lying. Despite her efforts, her mother's voice grew increasingly alarmed. "A bear? Oh my God, Megan! Are you in the hospital? Do you need us to come up there?" "No, Mom, I'm home. It's just some cuts on my leg. I have antibiotics and pain meds, and I'm supposed to stay off it for a week or so, but I'm fine." "Really?" Her father's voice came on the line, calmer but no less concerned. "Megan, this is exactly what we worried about when you moved up there. Alaska is beautiful, but it's dangerous." "I know, Dad," Megan said, fighting the irrational surge of defensiveness she always felt when her parents questioned her decision to move to Alaska. "I made a mistake going on that trail alone. It won't happen again." The conversation continued in this vein for some time, with her parents alternating between expressions of relief that she was alive and admonishments about the dangers of her chosen home. By the time Megan hung up, she was exhausted and emotionally drained, but she had at least managed to convince them not to fly up to Anchorage, for now. The rest of the day passed in a haze of pain medication, naps, and brief forays around her apartment on crutches. Linda called in the afternoon to check on her, and Dave dropped by with more groceries and takeout for dinner, refusing Megan's attempts to pay him back. "Just pay it forward someday," he said with a dismissive wave. That evening, curious about Ron's mention of the news, Megan searched online for reports of the bear attack. She found a brief article on the Alaska Daily News website. Hiker injured in defensive bear attack on Chugach Trail. The article gave only the barest details. An unnamed female hiker had encountered a mother grizzly with a cub on Tuesday morning and sustained non-life-threatening injuries before being assisted by other hikers. It included quotes from a wildlife officer about the importance of carrying bear spray and making noise on trails, and noted that warning signs had been posted in the area. Megan stared at the screen, struck by how the most terrifying experience of her life had been reduced to a few paragraphs of clinical reporting, soon to be forgotten by anyone who happened to read it. In a way, it was a relief. Her privacy maintained, the event acknowledged but not sensationalized. But there was also something alienating about seeing her trauma condensed into such neat, impersonal terms. She closed the browser and opened her photo editing software instead, scrolling through images she'd taken of the Chugach Mountains in different seasons and lights. Would she ever see them the same way again? Would she ever feel that same joy and freedom on the trails that had become her sanctuary since moving to Alaska? She wasn't sure. The following days fell into a monotonous rhythm of pain management, wound care, and boredom. Linda visited regularly, bringing fresh bandages and checking Megan's stitches for signs of infection. Dave stopped by with groceries and occasional treats: Alaskan craft beer, homemade cookies from his wife, a stack of books from the used bookstore he managed downtown. Ron called daily with updates from the diner and assurances that her job was secure. On the third day after the attack, a man from the Department of Fish and Game arrived at Megan's apartment. He introduced himself as Officer Mike Tanner, a wildlife management specialist, and explained that he wanted to get a more detailed account of the encounter for their records. "We've had reports of this particular sow and cub in that area before," he explained, as he sat at Megan's kitchen table, notebook open in front of him. "No aggressive incidents until now, but it's good to track patterns of behavior." Megan recounted the events again, the narrative becoming more practiced with each telling. Officer Tanner nodded occasionally, asking specific questions about the bear's behavior before and during the attack. "Sounds like a typical defensive response," he said when she had finished. "You surprised her. She perceived a threat to her cub. She charged to neutralize that threat. Once you were no longer directly threatening the cub up in the tree, her aggression level dropped." "So what happens now?" Megan asked. "With the bear, I mean." Officer Tanner closed his notebook. "Nothing, most likely. We've posted warnings at the trailhead, and we'll monitor reports of sightings in that area. But the bear was behaving naturally, protecting her young. That's not grounds for removal or relocation." "Even though she attacked me?" Megan couldn't keep the edge from her voice. The officer's expression was sympathetic but firm. "Ms. Cole, you're in bear country. They were here first, and this is their natural behavior. It's unfortunate that you were injured, but from a wildlife management perspective, this was not an unusual or excessive response from the bear." After he left, Megan sat for a long time, turning his words over in her mind. The bear was just being a bear. The wilderness was just being wilderness. It was Megan who had been out of place, not the animal that had attacked her. The realization wasn't exactly comforting, but it offered a perspective she hadn't fully considered. A week after the attack, Megan returned to the hospital to have her stitches checked. The wounds were healing well with no signs of infection, though the doctor warned her that the scarring would be significant. "The good news is, you can start putting some weight on that leg now," the doctor said. "Short periods at first, using one crutch for support. Listen to your body. If it hurts, stop, but movement will help the healing process at this stage." The prospect of increased mobility lightened Megan's mood considerably. The confinement to her apartment had been nearly as difficult to bear as the physical pain, especially for someone accustomed to daily runs in the open air. That afternoon, she ventured outside for the first time since the attack, making it as far as the small park across from her apartment complex before the exertion and pain forced her to rest on a bench. The sun was warm on her face as she sat there, watching children play on the swings and slides under the watchful eyes of their parents. An older man walked past with a golden retriever on a leash, the dog's tail wagging enthusiastically as it sniffed at every bush and lamppost. Normal life continuing all around her, untouched by the trauma that had so profoundly altered her own sense of security in the world. When she returned to her apartment, Megan found herself drawn to the landscape photographs on her walls again. There was one in particular that she kept coming back to, a shot of the Chugach Mountains at sunrise, the peaks catching the first light while the valleys remained in shadow. She had taken it during her first winter in Alaska, the cold so intense that her camera batteries had drained within minutes and her fingers had nearly frozen despite heavy gloves. But the result had been worth it. The mountains rendered in shades of gold and purple, the snow-covered slopes gleaming like polished metal in the dawn light. It was still beautiful, she realized. Despite everything, the mountains were still beautiful to her. The knowledge that they harbored dangers, bears and avalanches and hypothermia and 100 other potential threats, didn't diminish their majesty or their pull on her spirit. If anything, the awareness of that duality, beauty and danger existing side by side, added a depth to her appreciation that hadn't been there before. That night, Megan dreamed of the bear again, but the dream was different. She was watching, from a distance, as the mother grizzly taught her cub to fish in a clear mountain stream, their movements careful and deliberate in the sunlit water. There was no fear in the dream, only a quiet acknowledgement of witnessing something ancient and necessary, a small glimpse into a world that existed alongside her own, but operated by entirely different rules. She woke feeling oddly at peace, the persistent ache in her leg, a reminder of those different rules and the cost of forgetting them. Outside her window, the first light of dawn was touching the distant peaks of the Chugach Range, turning them the same gold as in her photograph. Megan watched the light spread, filling the valleys, and made a decision. She would go back to those mountains eventually, not to the same trail perhaps, and certainly not alone, at least not at first. But she would go back. Alaska was her home now, bears and all. 2 weeks after the attack, the last of Megan's stitches were removed. The scars on her calf were livid and raised, 3 parallel lines running diagonally across the muscle. They'll fade somewhat with time, the doctor assured her, but they'll always be visible. A conversation starter, at least. Megan traced the scars with her fingertips, feeling the slightly rough texture of the healing tissue. These marks would be with her for life, a permanent reminder of her encounter with the grizzly. But instead of seeing them as disfiguring, she found herself viewing them as a badge of sorts, evidence that she had faced one of the wild's most fearsome inhabitants and survived to tell the tale. She returned to work at the Moose Drop Inn the following day, using a single crutch for support during her shift. The regular customers greeted her with varying degrees of curiosity and concern, most having heard about her bear adventure through the small-town grapevine of Anchorage. "Show us the battle scar," called Hank, a retired fisherman who came in every morning for coffee and eggs over easy. Megan smiled but shook her head. "Maybe once they're less ugly, Hank. Right now they'd put you off your breakfast." Ron kept her shifts shorter than usual for the first week back, insisting she take breaks to elevate her leg in the office when the diner wasn't busy. The work was tiring, but it felt good to be contributing again, to be part of the normal flow of life instead of isolated in her apartment with only her thoughts and memories for company. As May turned to June, and spring gave way to the brief but intense Alaskan summer, Megan's physical recovery continued steadily. She graduated from the crutch to walking unassisted, though her gait retained a slight hitch when she was tired. She began rebuilding her strength with short walks, gradually extending her range, but always in populated areas of the city, always within sight of buildings and roads. The psychological recovery was less straightforward. She still had nightmares about the attack, still flinched at unexpected movements in her peripheral vision. Certain sounds, a dog's growl, the scrape of furniture being moved across the floor, could trigger a flood of adrenaline that left her shaking and disoriented. Linda, who had become a good friend, suggested she might benefit from talking to a therapist specializing in trauma, and Megan eventually took her advice. Dr. Marshall, a soft-spoken woman with prematurely gray hair and kind eyes, helped Megan process the lingering effects of the attack. "What you're experiencing is normal," she assured Megan during their first session. "Your body and mind are still trying to protect you from a threat that's no longer present. With time and the right techniques, those responses will diminish." Through their weekly sessions, Megan began to understand how deeply the bear encounter had affected her sense of safety and control. She learned strategies for managing the flashbacks and anxiety, for recognizing when her body was responding to memories rather than present dangers. Slowly, the grip of fear began to loosen. One evening in late June, as Megan was finishing her shift at the diner, Dave and Linda came in for dinner. They had become regular visitors since the attack, their initial role as rescuers evolving into genuine friendship. After placing their orders, Linda leaned across the table with an expression that immediately made Megan suspicious. "We've been thinking," Linda began, "that it might be time for you to face the mountains again." Megan felt a flutter of anxiety in her chest. "What do you mean?" "Not the trail where it happened," Dave clarified quickly, "and not alone. But there's a group hike this weekend. 12 people at least, lots of noise, zero chance of surprising any wildlife. Pretty easy trail with great views. We thought maybe you'd like to join us." Megan's immediate instinct was to refuse, to retreat into the safety of city streets and well-populated parks. But beneath that reflexive fear, she recognized a longing for the mountains that had been smoldering quietly all these weeks. She missed the clean scent of the high-altitude air, the quality of silence that wasn't really silence at all, but a complex tapestry of wind and water and the subtle sounds of the forest. She missed feeling small beneath the vast sky, the perspective that the mountains had always given her. "Let me think about it," she said finally, not quite ready to commit but not rejecting the idea either. That night, Megan pulled out her camera for the first time since the attack. The battery was dead, having sat unused for so long, and she set it to charge while she browsed through the memory card on her computer. The last images she'd taken had been the weekend before the attack, sunrise shots of Eagle River. The water turned to liquid gold in the early light. Looking at them now, she felt a familiar stirring of creative excitement, an eye for composition that the bear's claws hadn't managed to extinguish, despite everything else they'd taken from her. The next morning, she called Linda. "Okay," she said simply, "I'll go on the hike." Saturday dawned clear and mild, perfect hiking weather. Megan felt a mixture of anticipation and dread as she packed her small backpack, water, trail mix, first aid kit, and yes, bear spray, clipped where she could reach it instantly. She hesitated over her camera before finally adding it to the pack. Even if she didn't use it, it felt important to bring it, a symbol of reclaiming what had been taken from her on that other trail. Dave and Linda picked her up at 8 a.m., their Subaru already containing 2 other hikers, a middle-aged couple named Paul and Sarah who greeted Megan warmly. At the trailhead, they met the rest of the group, an assortment of experienced hikers and outdoor enthusiasts, all equipped with bear spray and an awareness of proper backcountry protocols. The trail they'd chosen was on the opposite side of the Chugach Range from where Megan's attack had occurred, a popular route known for wildflower meadows and views of Turnagain Arm. It was well maintained and frequently traveled, with little undergrowth along the path where wildlife could hide undetected. As they set out, the group naturally spread into smaller clusters engaged in conversation, creating a steady stream of human noise that would alert any nearby animals to their presence. Megan walked with Linda near the middle of the group, her heart rate gradually calming as the familiar rhythm of hiking began to override her anxiety. The trail climbed steadily but not steeply, winding through stands of spruce and hemlock, before opening into meadows where early summer wildflowers were beginning to bloom, lupine and fireweed creating splashes of purple among the green. "How are you doing?" Linda asked quietly after they'd been hiking for about 40 minutes. "I need a break." Megan assessed herself honestly. Her leg ached slightly, but not unbearably so, and her breathing was even despite the elevation gain. Emotionally, she was coping better than she'd expected. The constant chatter of the group around her, the well-worn path beneath her feet, and the clear sightlines in all directions combined to create a sense of security she hadn't anticipated. "I'm okay," she replied, surprising herself with the truth of it. "Better than okay, actually. This feels good." Linda smiled, a quick glance of understanding passing between them. They continued upward, Megan finding herself increasingly able to focus on the beauty around her rather than potential dangers. When they stopped for a water break at a particularly scenic overlook, she even took out her camera, capturing the sweep of the valley below and the distant shimmer of water where Turnagain Arm curved away toward Cook Inlet. The click of the shutter was like reconnecting with a part of herself that had been dormant since the attack. The part that saw Alaska not just as a place of danger and survival, but as a landscape of almost supernatural beauty, worthy of reverence and record. She took more photos as they continued their ascent, her eye finding compositions in the interplay of light and shadow, the textures of rock and vegetation, the vast scale of mountains against sky. By the time they reached the summit meadow, Megan's camera was warm in her hands from constant use. The group spread out among the rocks and tufts of grass to eat lunch, exclaiming over the 360-degree views that encompassed everything from the city of Anchorage to the waters of Cook Inlet to the seemingly endless ranks of mountains stretching toward the horizon. Megan found a comfortable spot slightly apart from the others, unwrapping the sandwich she'd packed and gazing out over the landscape. Linda joined her after a moment, sitting quietly beside her before finally speaking. "Look at you," she said, her tone warm with approval. "When we found you in that tree, I honestly wasn't sure you'd ever want to see a mountain again, let alone come back like this." Megan considered this, her eyes still on the distant peaks. "I wasn't sure either," she admitted, "but being away from them was. It felt like being separated from something essential. Does that make sense?" Linda nodded. "Completely. I've been hiking these mountains for 20 years, and I still feel that way when I'm stuck in the city too long. They get under your skin." "They do," Megan agreed. She touched her calf absently, feeling the raised lines of her scars through the fabric of her hiking pants. "I'll always be more cautious now. I'll probably never hike alone again, at least not on the remote trails. But I couldn't stay away forever. This is part of why I live here." On the descent, Megan found herself moving more freely, her body remembering the rhythms of the trail, her mind less vigilant with each step. When a marmot darted across the path ahead of them, she started but didn't panic, her hand moving toward the bear spray but stopping when her brain processed what she'd actually seen. Progress, she thought. Back at the trailhead, as the group dispersed to their vehicles with exchanges of phone numbers and promises to hike together again, Megan felt a profound sense of accomplishment that had little to do with the physical challenge of the hike. She had faced the mountains again, had looked her fear in the eye and refused to let it define her future in Alaska. In the car heading back to Anchorage, she scrolled through the photos she'd taken, pleased with several of them despite her months away from regular practice. Dave glanced at her in the rear-view mirror. "And so, verdict?" he asked, the question encompassing more than just her opinion of the hike. Megan looked up from her camera, meeting his eyes in the mirror. "I'm glad I went," she said simply, "and I'd like to go again." That evening, alone in her apartment, Megan downloaded the day's photos to her computer and began the process of sorting and editing them. One image in particular caught her attention, a shot of the trail winding through a meadow filled with lupine, the mountains rising beyond, their slopes dappled with sunlight and shadow. She worked on it carefully, adjusting the contrast and saturation until it captured exactly what she'd felt in that moment on the mountain, a sense of wonder tinged with respect, of beauty that existed alongside the ever-present potential for danger. When she was satisfied with the edit, she printed the image and found a frame for it. She hung it on her wall among her other landscape photographs, a visual declaration that Alaska, with all its contradictions and challenges, remained her chosen home. Her leg ached slightly as she stepped back to examine the arrangement. The scars of her encounter with the grizzly, a permanent part of her now, like the mountains themselves, etched into her identity. In the months that followed, Megan continued to heal, both physically and emotionally. Her leg grew stronger, the angry red of her scars gradually fading to silvery white. She hiked with Dave and Linda regularly, venturing onto increasingly challenging trails as her confidence returned. She never again went alone into the backcountry, having learned that lesson at too high a cost, but she found that sharing the wilderness with trusted companions brought its own rewards. Her photography flourished in this new phase of her relationship with Alaska. There was a depth to her images now that hadn't been there before, a more nuanced understanding of the landscape she was capturing, informed by personal experience of both its beauty and its hazards. She began showing her work at local art fairs and markets, selling prints to tourists and locals alike, slowly building a reputation beyond her circle of friends. Occasionally, someone would notice her scars when she wore shorts in the brief. Alaskan summer heat. Most people were too polite to comment, but every now and then someone would ask. Megan developed a simplified version of the story for casual inquiries. Had a run-in with a mama grizzly a couple years back, but for those who seemed genuinely interested, she would share more details. Not to sensationalize the experience, but because she'd come to believe that her story, like her photographs, could help others appreciate the complex reality of life in wild places. The bear itself remained a presence in the area, according to reports from fish and game officials. She and her cub were spotted periodically on the more remote trails of the Chugach Mountains, behaving normally, avoiding humans when possible. Megan sometimes thought about them during her hikes in other parts of the range. The massive mother, teaching her growing cub the skills it would need to survive, both of them simply living according to their nature, in a landscape that made room for their kind alongside hers. On the anniversary of the attack, Megan took the day off from the diner and drove to a viewpoint overlooking the area where it had happened. She didn't hike into those specific trails. She wasn't sure she ever would again, but she sat on a bench at the scenic overlook, her camera beside her, and watched the play of clouds and sunlight over the forested slopes. The mountains were neither malevolent nor benign, she reflected. They simply were. Like the bears that roamed their flanks, like the storms that sometimes engulfed their peaks, they existed without regard for human desires or fears. Their indifference was part of their power and their appeal. They stood as a reminder of a world beyond human control, a world operating by older and more absolute laws than those governing the cities below. Megan had come to Alaska, seeking adventure and beauty, and she had found both, along with a hard-won wisdom about her place in the natural order. Her scars were a map of that journey, a permanent record of the day the wilderness had reached out with tooth and claw to remind her of its true nature. But they were also a testament to survival, to the human capacity to endure and adapt and find meaning in even the most frightening experiences. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting their slopes in shades of gold and rose, Megan lifted her camera and began to shoot. Through her lens, she framed the interplay of light and shadow, the textures of forest and rock, the vastness of the landscape against the deepening sky. In each click of the shutter, in each careful composition, there was both homage and acceptance, an acknowledgement of the mountain's power and a quiet insistence on her own right to witness and record their beauty, scars and all. The bear walked on through the forest, her cubs now grown and gone their separate ways, her powerful form moving with the confident grace of an apex predator in its prime. If she remembered the human female she had confronted years before, if she retained any impression of that brief, violent intersection of their lives, there was no way to know. She continued on her path through the mountains, indifferent to the stories humans told about her kind, concerned only with the ancient cycles of survival that had shaped her species for millennia. Hunting, eating, denning, breeding, raising cubs, and moving always through the vast wilderness that was her unquestioned domain. And in the city below, Megan Cole touched the scars on her leg absently as she prepared her photographs for an upcoming exhibition, Encounters, Alaska's Wild Heart. The silvery lines a permanent connection to the day when the wilderness had marked her as its own.